Sir, are you ready, sir? Shall we start?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, sir. Sir, are you ready, sir? Shall we start?
Good evening. This is the second session of the webinar on pandemic history organized by East Wing, Directorate of Distance Education, Annamalai University, Tamil Nadu. It's a pleasure to me to welcome Dr. Sebastian Joseph, Faculty, Union Christian College, Alva, Kerala. I take this opportunity to introduce Sir Sebastian Joseph, the resource person of the session. Professor Sebastian Joseph is a triple code in history. He has secured a state merit scholarship for his higher studies. Recently, he has been awarded Charles Wallace Grant of British Council for his academic pursuit, for that he had visited England recently. For the sake of his institution, he has been editing a journal called Discourse. Besides, he has acted as a resource person for a lot of workshops, seminars, refresher courses, and video programs like this. Being specialized on environmental history, oral history, family history, and clinic history, he has presented a lot of research papers on this trusty area of research. I request Professor Sebastian Joseph to proceed with the session. Thank you, sir. Please.
Thank you, Professor Shankari, for the brief introduction. And thank you also for the invite to present my thoughts entitled On Distancing the Infected Body, Reflections on Social Distancing. So we have listened to Professor Shankari yesterday. So I hope all of you have got a very good historical contextual understanding about the history of pandemics and the ways in which pandemics visited the planet Earth in various phases as per the chronological order. So today I will be discussing a topic which is very familiar to you now, because all of you are socially distanced from your kith and kin, your associates, your friends, or your officers, or playgrounds, or markets, or business centers, whatever be like that. So we are now in a world of distancing ourselves, even though we are very near with the latest technology, the technology that connects all of you from the far off regions in the world. So as a matter of fact, I was thinking of sharing certain photographs to you as a prelude to my lecture. And then I will be giving you a lecture without a PowerPoint, which is usually the method which I adopt. So I request Dr. Santosh, a faculty in the engineering college, to share the visuals I have provided him with. So this is actually my title. You can look at the title and understand what is the basic argument that I'm going to propose, because it's actually the infected body. So we are all scared about the infected body. Whose body is infected, whether ourselves or whether it's our friends or relatives or people who are not known to us. So the infected body has become something like a culture site all over the world, to think the ways and means to contain the virus by cordoning or secluding the particular body. So that's why the title is On Distancing the Infected Body, Reflections on Social Distancing. Actually, these reflections are from the point of view of a historian or a student or teacher of history, and not from the point of view of a medical practitioner or a social activist or a scientist. So that is my take on the title. Next slide, please. So this is actually Napoleon Bonaparte visiting plagued people. So the picture shows, the agony of the people. If you can see the picture in the through the particular site, you can see the emotional variance, the emotional, what you call the anxiety and agony on the face of individuals. Next slide, please. This is a lazaretto. Lazaretto was it was a particular building to house the infected bodies, house the people who were infected. This one is from Malta, which had an easy access to the sea. All the lazarettos all over the world, most of these lazarettos, had easy access to the sea, because largely this was considered as a seaborne disease. So all the ships which came to particular regions were actually first inspected, and people were taken, the sailors and all traders inside the ships, and including the cargo, were taken for a quarantine, and then only it was released. Next picture. This is actually a sketch of a lazaretto. You can see that how the lazaretto is arranged, and the pattern, the interior design of the lazaretto, with a dome-like structure, which shows something like people who supervisors used to sit there with a surveillance mechanism, something like a panopticon of the concept of panopticon that was argued by Jeremy Bentham, later postulated by Michel Foucault. Next. So this is an interior layout of a lazaretto in Venice. You can see that how well it was structured, with each areas, well structured and engineering. It is such an engineering intelligence shows. You can understand through these pictures how people were not easily allowed to move in between. Next. This is a Lazaretto city and sea network effect. How the Lazarettos constructed were all over the world, were connected to the seas, and how these Lazarettos proved to be a very protective enclosures for the urban centers. Next. This is a sketch of a San Leopoldo Lazaretto. You can see the access to the sea, and you can also see the building, which was in a serial, something like an open-ended building in the initial stage, and then once you enter it, you are put into different cubicles, and then you are supervised there. So there is only one entrance, and it was blocked from all the sides. I will give you the description about all the Lazarettos in my lecture. Next. So this was actually a notice in Europe about cholera notice, because cholera was usually associated with the Indian conditions, and then it had the honorific of Indian in the beginning. Next. This is a plagued street in Europe in the 17th century. You can see from the painting, how desolate people were, how they were subjected to the tyrannies of a disease caused by a bacteria, Yersinia pestis. Next. This is Dance of Death, a visual representation of the period, the agony of the people, the fear of the people about death. But death was considered, you can see that death is dancing with everyone, irrespective of the social classes. It's called the Danse Macabre. That means death was sure and certain, irrespective of the social stratification, irrespective of the community affiliation you had. So what was happening in during the time of Black Death and the succeeding stages when plague revisited Europe is the dance of death. Death became a metaphor, a motif in that sense. Next. This is a plague doctor. You have seen some various pictures and photos from the website. You can see that how plague doctor was something looking like a very fearful appearance. You can see the torchlight that is in the left hand. On the face, you can see the big nose, that is the mask, which was invested with chemicals and purifying chemicals and also other spices in order to get him secured from transmitting bad air, because bad air was considered to be one of the important reasons for plague, such infectious diseases in those times. This is called the miasmatic environmentalism. Actually, only later stage we found that it was a bacteria, and it was not because of any bad air problem. Next. This is the medieval to modern. I would like to always to look at the modern doctor and the medieval doctor, except for the appearance, just for that big nose like mask, practically there is no difference. But the picturization in the plague doctor carries a different meaning, in the sense that the people were actually fearing death that much. Therefore, sophistication of science, advancement of scientific protective equipments, etc., gives a more fine-tuned or sophisticated appearance for the modern doctor or the health servant. Next. You can see that it was during a Spanish flu how people were effectively cubicalized into different segments. Next. This was a particular machine which was used to fumigate and disinfect the cloths and other items which were taken by people who were supposedly infected people. Next. This is actually lepers reaching for food, and they were actually not permitted to meet and interact with the people. So there were certain equipment, certain areas where they could get water or food completely cordoned off from the public for the safety of the public, to containing the disease, the leprosy. Next. Next, please. Next. So this is again a person is inspecting people with infected diseases. It's a surveillance mechanism in medieval Europe. Next. Now, you coming to the modern age or post-modern age, you can see deserted cities like this. When the coronavirus ruled, the entire city, which was full of people, full of movement, has come to a standstill, and you can see deserted cities in most. This is a European city, so you can see cities like this everywhere in the world. Next. So you see what is actually social distancing. I prefer to call it as physical distancing. I will tell you, explain to you what is actually the problem with social distancing and physical distancing. You can see that the same people living in same compound or apartment are not able to meet beyond a particular limit distance. So the entire, as if now we are waving at the friend, by looking at him, you cannot touch him because touch me not is the rule that we are following these days. Next. Now we have got a masked society. You can see the mask worn by one individual there, that embroidered mask, that's actually a mask that is produced by the Toda tribes in Nilgiris. So everyone is coming out with the mask in that sense, the tribal people or people from the Amazon forest, they are using a steamed, banana leaves for making mask. And you can see on the left side of the picture, you can see people coming out with a fancy mask in order to make it very live in that sense. So there are studios in Kerala which definitely take your facial image and affix it on the mask so that people can easily identify you. So now it's a masked society which can be considered as a new normal, not a normal, but a new normal. Next. Next, please. There are so many cartoons are appeared, because it's also a cartoons, how they project and idealize and visualize the role of the corona, even in some of the most popular cartoons kids are using. Next. This is a virus media, and they are going near the virus and talking with the virus, and what about their plan to wipe out humanity is a question that is asked by the reporter. Very interesting to see how the media is projecting it. Apart from very, what you call very informative sessions, it's also very dreadful and fearful media presentation causing worry and harm to many of the people. Next. Now, this is in my terms, I consider these people as the highway citizens, while some people are social distanced, while some people are quarantined, you were able to see people moving and walking in India from, up to 3,000 kilometers in India. So I would rather like to call these people as highway citizens. Next. So this is playing with death, playing chess with death. This is actually a picture from a film that is directed by Ingmar Bergman. Bergman's Seventh Seal. I think history teachers and students should definitely view this film because death is becoming an actor through a person here. Death is one actor along with others, and people were playing chess with the death. Depicting how people were afraid of death during the time of plague, a revisit of the plague. Next. So now this is a history teacher, and the doctor is telling, you tell me that I should forget the past and go on with my life. But doctor, I am the history teacher. So history teachers, you cannot simply forget the past and come to the present like that, because always we live in the present, but we should use the past as certain episodes and certain examples in order to understand the happenings that are quite unusual and unprecedented in the history of the world now. Next. So this is actually the rule of a virus, because we are conducting even the webinar because this is a rule of the virus. So we'll be engaging with some of the deeper historical context within which the idea of something like a situation has come when the rule of the humanity or rule of the humane is getting into confrontation with the rule of the virus. So let us see how it works. So now I will take a lecture for you, and then we will have interaction towards the end. Can you stop the slide sharing, Dr. Santosh? So, okay, this is actually, see why I exhibited these photographs before my lecture is that the point that I am going to discuss is social distancing. And social distancing as a therapeutic or as a medical intervention is the only possible recovery measure for the entire humanity now. So right from ancient times to modern times, we are relying on this particular therapeutics or something which can be considered as a non-pharmaceutical engagement based on our procedural understanding about the past episodes of plague or other flus, especially Spanish flu, malaria, cholera, and all the kinds of epidemics which wrecked the human civilization. So that's why I am going to talk on social distancing, and the pictures are very important for understanding the theme social distancing, because the pictures reveal the kind of agony people were experiencing in the past. One important thing I wish to tell you is, and actually that's a theory postulated by Hayden White, which is called history of 40. History of 40 means studying history through photographs, paintings, and cinema. So it's very important to look at the visuals now, because standing within the particular environment today, when the coronavirus rules the world, the whole world, certain visuals are coming. So these visuals from the present are very important for understanding the history of the past. So no visual in the present is devoid of a sense of history in that sense, because history lives very much in the present. To quote again Foucault, history is a presentist science, social science. Whatever we write, whatever we interpret about the past is based on our judgment. Because whatever the records we consult are records of the past. A historian standing in 2020 experiencing coronavirus, okay? And that historian, when he moves on to the archives, when he comes up with a file regarding the plague episode in Europe or India or cholera or malaria, naturally the experiential level of the historiography changes in that sense, because now we are experienced. We have certain visuals in our mind, visuals through cartoons, visual through news, news bulletins, visual through interpretations, visuals through series articles, the live visuals which we are seeing today. That's why I exhibited the visuals prior to my talk, because visuals carry a very important meaning for historian. Now, coming to the present again, now my contestation is that there are three alphabets that determine the world today across nations. These three alphabets, there are actually four alphabets, but I am saying three, taking one alphabet, two alphabets as one. That is MSDQ. When you look at the present world, you'll be able to understand that what we think, what we do, what is the consciousness today. It revolves around three artifacts or motifs in that sense. One is the mask. You can see that people are wearing mask everywhere. People have to wear a mask everywhere. Mask, once prior to the corona times, the mask was not that a particular good symbol to see. When you see a masked man, naturally you will have a certain doubts about that person. So whether he's infected, what is his problem, like that. But now when you see an unmasked person, then definitely you are troubled, because you are not sure about whether the person is infected or not. So mask in that sense, very unusual and not normal in the past, has become very normal and very usual. So that's why we are using the term new normal in that sense, mask. So mask reveals two things. One is that you are living in a masked society. You have to wear the mask in order to protect from a particular pandemic, a particular virus. Secondly, the thing is that it also explains that you are subjected to wear the mask because of the extractive tendency of the humans particularly relating to natural resources. What kind of a mode of resource use we were following? Very extractive, penetrating the nature and taking all the resources, in a very profligate manner. So that is why the mask is on us. So the mask has become very usual. It is not unusual. It is very normal. And the second alphabet is SD, taken together SD, that is social distancing. That we have to be away from your friends. We have to be away from associates, even family members for a time being. That is social distancing. Is it the only panacea for the present pandemic? That's the thing that we need to understand. So social distancing has become a mechanism like that in order to get you recover, in order to make you safe from the infection caused by the virus, by opening to a person who is actually an infected one. And the next step, the extreme form of social distancing, something like a solitary confinement or isolationism, is quarantine. So these three alphabets, taken together, three alphabets, MSGQ, rules the world now. It has become a new world order in that sense. It has become quite usual. It has become quite normal. So when you go out to the college or to the university or to the school or to the officers, your wife or your father may remind you, take the mask also. And sometimes we also take the sanitizers also with us. Usually people go to distance places by cars, so then actually they take sanitizers also. All these have become very regular and routinized affairs in the human civilization. So now, what is actually social distancing? Social distancing is actually a step, a method to slow down the spread of infectious diseases. Actually, to slow down the spread of infectious diseases and avoid overburdening healthcare systems, particularly the pandemic. So there are several social distancing methods which we use, like like the one is actually the wearing of the mask. Then there is isolation, and then there is a quarantine, the extreme form of social distancing, and then there is a restriction on the movement of the people, and also cancellation of mass gatherings, because we were celebrating the prior world, that is the world prior to the pandemic, that is corona. We are celebrating with a lot of activities. We were actually enjoying and celebrating the material culture. It actually, what we were celebrating was a material culture, a kind of culture that was so extractive, that was so what you call commercially oriented and market oriented. So now we have come to stop all these mass gatherings. Now you are isolated. Now you are in a house. Now you are in a college, or now you are in an office, away from your friends and fellow men. So what led to this kind of, an uneasy, uncanny situation in the present days? We need to go to the first episode of annihilation in the world. The first episode of annihilation will definitely remind us of one dictum, that infectious diseases are fundamental determinants of human history. Diseases have wrecked the world. It brought down empires. It brought down people and systems. It created and recreated new systems and new political structures in that sense. The first case I'm taking is the plague in the medieval times. I'm not going to explain all the pandemic or the diseases which affected the human civilization, but selectively for within a particular period of time, I have to explain what is social distancing. So the first case I'm taking is the plague of the medieval times as an event that affected the human race as a pandemic with a never before experience, the plague. That was the Justinian plague, which actually happened in the period from the 6th to the 8th centuries of Christian era. The first epidemic that shook a major part of the world. And we are not sure that we cannot call it as a pandemic, but it was something like an epidemic, because it was concerned only to a very limited area, Europe, which for the first time evoked ideas about annihilation of the human race from the face of the earth. So annihilation was the particular thought that came to people, whether the entire the human race is going to be annihilated and exterminated. So there was a game between death and life in that sense of between people in those times. So that was a fear of annihilation. And sometimes it happened with, because the Justinian Empire, when there was an expansion in the empire, he told the world that empire making happens along with making of the diseases also. So when you have an empire in the making, then possibility is there that you have an empire of disease also in the making. So let us go to the first pandemic in that sense. The first pandemic is the Bubonic Plague and the Black Death, which happened from 8th to 13th centuries. From 8th after the Justinian Plague, from 8th to 13th centuries, there was practically no record about plagues. And environmental historians are saying that it was actually a very good period, and so environmentally it was good, and climate was conducive. But when the climate again worsened, then it reappeared in the 1340s with the cosmic debris. So it intensified. It actually got intensified with trading activities all over the globe. Now you see the advent of the most dreadful event of the Middle Ages, that is the Black Death, caused by bubonic plague, with swellings in the bubon. Bubon is an area below the abdomen, and it also came in the armpit. A swelling in the groins, like something like in a shape like an apple, or in some cases like an egg, it appeared. And later, the whole body became infected with bruises and blotches, and the person was actually, became a different person in that sense, infected body in that sense. So this thing you have to bear in mind, that is the body of a person got infected in a condition, and which led to a particular appearance for a body which was never before in the history of the human civilization. So usually this disease was carried forward by rats, and rats in that sense made ships in history. And the Black Death earned its name from a symptom, for example, the lymph nodes that became blackened and swollen after bacteria entered through the skin, bubonic plague. So as a matter of fact, in the aftermath, we can see for the first time, human civilization felt the wrath of disease. 50 million people died out of 80 million in Europe. To showcase in localities, for example, in a place in Italy, prior to the plague, there were about 403 persons living in an area, something like, an apartment area like that. After the plague, only 184 people remained. So it was a colossal impact on the human race. And plague also spread to so many places like London, and it also crossed the rivers, and it even came to India in a later period. And consider the economic effects, the scenario of the people who survived the plague, actually the standard of the survivors, as you understand from the degeneration of feudalism, it tremendously improved. General prices of land fell down, and feudal obligations were not able to be maintained due to outbreaks. So common people improved their standard of living, eating, and they started wearing good clothes, wearing costly clothes, and going to good lands, etc. So there was a mobility in that sense. The economic scenario after the plague was something very positive for the downtrodden and the common people. But definitely you can see that the government came with certain regulations for the people to dress according to their social status. But whatever be that, collective trauma was the end result of this particular episode of Black Death. And it became a wound deep in the social body. And many people tried to, explain it in their own terms. There is a spiritualistic interpretation from the part of the church that it tried to argue that it was a punishment from God. And medical experts and doctors or scientists, not scientists in the sense as we see today, people using scientific rationality were saying that it is because of mal air or bad air, and then victims were encouraged by the spiritual fathers to get blessings from the God by offering charity to the church, etc., etc. So the response to the disease in some sense can be seen from varied perspectives, but there was a common factor. That is what I am trying to explain in this lecture. The common factor was nothing but a mass culture or fear of death, collective trauma, as if we experience some trauma now. We are not sure at what point of time our body will get infected. So what is ruling the present world is also the same sensibility that ruled the medieval times, that is fear of death and total annihilation of the human race from the planet Earth. At this point of time comes, the containment policies or the theory of contagianism in that sense. But going back to the Black Death, I told you that it killed about more than 50 million people in the 14th century. Or statistically, you will be able to see that 60% of Europe's entire population. The disastrous mortal disease known as Black Death spread across the whole of Europe in 1346 to 1353. And now when you come to, again, the plague again repeated. I'm not going to showcase all these repetitions of the plague. It also visited India in the 1890s. The plague of 1896 was a disastrous one in India. So you'll be able to see that the Spanish flu, which infected around 500 million people, about 1/3 of the world's population. Again, that was in 1918, just while the war was about to end. So estimates as to how many infected people died vary greatly. But the flu is regardless considered to be one of the deadliest pandemics in history after this particular Black Death. So I tell you that, there was a series of, occurrence of plagues, but once after this particular plague episode, that is a Black Death, the most important, disease that dragged the whole human civilization is the Spanish flu. According to an estimate, a reassessment was there in 2018. And according to that reassessment, about 17 million people have been died during this period. With a world population of 1.8 to 1.9 billion, these estimates correspond to between 1 and 6% of the population. And this flu, that is Spanish flu, killed more people in 24 weeks than HIV and AIDS killed in 24 years. So this is the wrath of the flu. However, it killed a much lower percentage of the world's population than the Black Death, which lasted for more years. So counting on the periodicity of the event, even though it was just for 2 years, you can see that it killed more people than AIDS and HIV killed in 24 years. So you just cannot compare this with the disease which wrecked the human civilization, as I have already explained, the Black Death. But you can see the intensity of the flu in that sense. The disease killed in many parts of the world. It reached many parts. Some of about 12 to 17 million people died in India. That was about 5% of the population, according to the statistics of the population in those times. The death toll in India's British ruled states was 13.88 million. David Arnold estimates in 2019 estimated it as at least 12 million dead. So the wrath of the flu. So now, leaving away all the statistics and all the reports about these particular diseases and pandemics, let us see a new culture emerged. A culture, something like, as I have already told you, the dance of death culture. And the dance of death culture led to possible thinking of ways and means of, getting protected from the particular disease. There comes the importance of the term quarantine. Quarantine, which derived from an Italian quaranta, meaning 40, was adopted as an obligatory means of separating persons, animals, and goods. It doesn't mean that it is only the individuals, humans, but both animals and even plants were quarantined in some times. Even certain plant species were quarantined, and goods that may have been exposed to a contagious disease. Since the 14th century, quarantine has been cornerstone of coordinated disease control strategy, including isolation, sanitary cordons, bills of health issued to ships. Because every ship was asked to get a bill of health. In that sense, they have to show it while they reach the shore. Then fumigation and disinfection, and regulation of groups of persons who were believed to be responsible for spreading the infection. So in some sense, it was also racialized in certain extent that the Jews were considered to be the progenitors of this disease. And sometimes it was discussed that the people from the Arabian regions, are infecting the world, things like that. But whatever be like that, quarantine became a policy only from the 14th century. Organized institutional responses to disease control began during the plague epidemic, that is 1347 to 1352. The plague was initially spread by sailors, rats, and cargo arriving in Sicily from the eastern Mediterranean. It quickly spread throughout Italy, decimating the population of powerful city-states like Florence, Venice, and Genoa. So the pestilence then moved from ports in Italy to ports in France and Spain. So from northeastern Italy, the plague crossed the Alps and affected populations in Austria and Central Europe. Towards the end of the 14th century, the epidemic had abated, but not disappeared. Outbreaks of pneumonic and septicemic plague occurred in different cities during the next 350 years. So that is why the repetition of the plague, the revisit of plagues after the Black Death, actually prompted states to come up with this concept of quarantine. Even though quarantine was first introduced in 1377 in Dubrovnik, about Croatia because it's very familiar place for all of you with the World Cup football, Croatia. Dubrovnik is a city in Croatia. It was first introduced in 1377 in Dubrovnik on Croatia's Dalmatian coast. And the first permanent plague hospital, Lazaretto, was opened by Republic of Venice in 1423 on the small island of Santa Maria di Nazareth. The Lazaretto was commonly referred to as Nazaretto or Lazaretto because of the resemblance of the word to Lazar in the biblical name. It's a biblical name of Lazarus, who was made to resurrect from the dead through a miracle, that is performed by Jesus Christ. In 1467, Genoa adopted the Venetian system, and in 1476, Marseille in France, a hospital for persons with leprosy, were converted into a lazaretto. I think you know about the particular work written by Michel Foucault, Madness and Civilization, where he makes an argument that leper houses later became centers for psychological or psychiatric treatment in that sense. But here you see that these very leper houses were converted as lazarettos for quarantining people infected with plague. And the geographical, specification of the lazarettos is also very significant, because they were located far enough away from the center, because the people in the deep habitated states are to be safeguarded through the spread of disease. And wherever possible, lazarettos were located so that a natural barrier, such as a river or a sea, separated them from the city. That's why you have seen in the pictures that most of the lazarettos are open to the seas in that sense. So when natural barriers were not available in the form of seas or rivers, separation was achieved by encircling the lazaretto with a moat or a ditch. That is, even sometimes big surrounding fences were made around the lazarettos. In ports, lazarettos consisted of buildings used to ship passengers and crew who had or were suspected of having plague. Merchandise from ships was unloaded to designated buildings. Procedures for so-called purgation of the various products. Purgation means, actually they were put in a situation like a purgatory, where it is to be fumigated and disinfected in that sense. Purgation of various products were prescribed minutely. Wool, yarn, cloth, leather, wigs, and blankets were considered products most likely to transmit diseases. So treatment of goods consisted of continuous ventilation. Wax and sponge were used in running water for about 48 hours. And so the vast majority of the people quarantined, though were sailors, soldiers, and fishermen, who had to move back and forth across the Mediterranean. These people were crammed into tiny rooms and they had to stay there for weeks. This would have been almost unbearable. And you get a glimpse of it, even accounts written by very rich people. For example, some of the rich people who were, enjoying this quarantine as something like a leisure time or a vacation, something like that. There are wrote a lot of testimonies in that sense, through diaries and their scribblings, which are now even an important source space for people to understand about the history of quarantine. Boccaccio's Decameron is a very important book, which actually banked on these kind of testimonies in that sense, especially the testimonies that came from the elite people. One such traveler, for example, that is, I am quoting a diary, who could pay for a private lodging in a very expensive quarantine station. He witnessed some merciless people, some people who were subjected to the tyrannies of this disease, who were traveling, who were, all the way traveling kilometers in order to reach a particular place to take as a shelter. So there were actually some people where, they were staying in the camp outside in freezing weathers, in too cold weather conditions for 10 days, while wearing clothes that had been fumigated by dipping in cold water. So you then have to bear the winter outside, and also the dress that is not completely dried, because the dress was supposed to be fumigated by dipping in cold waters. And it is not known why usually the quarantine time is considered to be 40 days. But prior to that, it was a 30 days experience. It was actually a trend, which means, only 30 days, but it became 40 days. Many scholars are suggesting certain biblical connections and traditions to these 40 days because of the fasting of Jesus Christ for 40 days in the wilderness, and finally coming for an encounter with the Satan, signifying a major pandemic in that sense, maybe because of that. And these 40 days was chosen as length of isolation time needed to avoid contamination. It might have been, people are arguing, medical experts are arguing that it might have been derived from Hippocrates' theories regarding acute illness. Another theory is that the number of days was connected to the Pythagorean theory of numbers. The number 4 had particular significance. 40 days was the period of biblical travel of Jesus in the desert, as I already told you. 40 days were believed to represent the time necessary for dissipating the pestilential miasma. The pestilential miasma could be, negated through the 40 days, and goods through system of isolation, fumigation, and disinfection. In centuries that followed, the system of isolation was improved in that sense. And to take, for example, a captain of a ship, what sort of engagement or surveillance he has to pass through. The captain of a ship who used to arrive at ports were to anchor the ship at a long distance and come in a lifeboat to the health magistrate's office, and he was kept in enclosure where he spoke only through a window. This conversation took place between the captain and the magistrate through the window at a safe distance, that's social distancing. This precaution was based on a mistaken hypothesis, actually, that is the pestilential air transmitted all communicable diseases. But the precaution did prevent direct person-to-person transmission through inhalation of contaminated aerosolized droplets. That is why even today we are following the same practice which was followed by the people in the Mediterranean in the 16th and 17th centuries. And then the captain had to show proof of health of the sailors and passengers and provide information on the origin of merchandise on board. If there was suspicion of disease in the ship, the captain was ordered to proceed to the quarantine station, where passengers and crew were isolated, and the vessel was thoroughly fumigated and retained for 40 days. This system, which was used by Italian cities, was later adopted by almost all other European countries. The thing is that in some cases, the entire ship was drowned in the water for excessive cases of, this kind of infection, if it was found. And then when you come from the in the medieval period or in the early modern period to the time of Spanish influenza during 1918, 1919, in a world divided by war, by the multilateral health surveillance systems, which had been laboriously built during the previous decades in Europe and United States, were not helpful in controlling the influenza pandemic. You know that the ancestor of the World Health Organization, the Office International de Hygiene, it was called, it was located in Paris, could not play any role during the outbreak. At the beginning of the pandemic, the medical officers of the army isolated soldiers with signs or symptoms, but the disease, which was extremely contagious, quickly spread, infecting persons in nearly every country. So various responses to the pandemic were tried. Health authorities in major cities of Western world implemented a range of disease containment strategy, including the closure of schools, churches, theaters, and suspension of public gatherings. In Paris, for example, a sporting event in which 10,000 youths were to participate, that is postponed. Yale University cancelled its all on-campus public meetings, and some churches in Italy suspended confessions and funeral ceremonies. Physicians encouraged the use of measures like respiratory hygiene and social distancing. So at that time also, the only solution, the panacea for the disease, was social distancing. Because this is the problem with science, when it encounters with a particular pandemic or an infection, then a lot of research has to be carried out. Because a virus all come in a particular time as something like an accident in a human civilization. And now, see, the quarantine period was also considered to be, it can be considered also, it can be discussed and interpreted from a colonial framework in that sense, So because the miasmatic theory of the history of quarantine, it shows that, in sometimes the quarantine theory was not promoted by the British regime because they were all afraid of, the loss of trade and the accruing of profit from the internationalization of trade, which was a major leadership was in the hands of the British capitalists and industries. So that's why it also led to a particular theorization of miasmatic environmentalism. And this theory was suggested by the English, that is the British, and as a medical theory that attributed transmission of epidemics to atmospheric pollution and foul air and climate, as well as contaminated water. This theory rejected quarantine methods and instead tried to promote regulation by sanitation, in that sense, regulated sanitation, cleanliness of the environment, and personal hygiene. And such anti-contagionist policy was in harmony with the free trade and open sea policy of the English, an ideology that actually emanated from the lobbying classes of international merchants. And there were also certain interpretation from the side of the British medical experts and scientists looking at the diseases as something like, emanating from the bad tropics in that sense. Something tropical with the anti-contagionist policy was the ideation of tropicalization of diseases, which is argued by David Arnold, that diseases arising from the bad tropics in Africa and Asia. This led to something like a phenomena of racialization of the diseases. And that is why people in the Europe usually addressed malaria as something connected to the Indian malaria, Indian cholera, and the snail fever and cholera also got associated with India. So they propagated the idea of tropical diseases, ascribing the origin of infectious diseases to hot climate and contaminated waters in the backward area of Africa and Asia. And this was one of the major arguments raised by a British medical journal in the year 1893. This enabled the British to claim, in some other sense, you can also understand the political history on a very different note. This enabled the British to claim these lands for the civilizing mission that would lead to progress in such areas. That is why they said that all the tropics need to be cleared of jungles and malware, that it needs to be civilized. So civilization of not only the humans, but civilizing the environment was also a priority with the European nations in those times. It was actually a moral and cultural justification for expanding hegemony in the colonies. And one more big thing that comes to my mind while I'm discussing this contagianism is that, the British anti-contagianism, it succeeded in racializing diseases in that sense, because European science was influenced with the strong, powerful presence of an imperial spirit in the era. So the ships that, contagious ships were determined by and declared by the origin. And most often, the ships which started its voyage from Arabian countries were stigmatized as highly contagious and infective, and also ships from Asian countries, including India. So there was a bipolarity in the political arena, which depicted the European white bodies and white shipments and their merchandise, which were considered to be more cleaner than other ships and consignments, which usually were affixed with the stamp of contagianism. So contagianism in that sense, quarantine in that sense became a racialized political ideology, which polarized Europe from the rest of the world in that sense, especially Arabia and Asia. And this becomes more implicit in certain lacertus. I'm talking something about the differentiation of the body while it is socially distanced even at the time of pandemic. And this becomes more implicit in lacertus classification. So lacertus were classified like this, that certain lacertus for healthy Europeans, and certain lacertus for the suspect Egyptians who came from Africa and Syria, and finally the most contagious, most infected bodies that came from the Arabian countries and Asian countries, including India. So quite naturally, the white bodies were subjected to lighter treatment, and they were subjected to a very liberal quarantine, reducing the days of quarantine, while strictest segregation was enforced in the case of non-Europeans. And even some of the non-European ships were burned with the entire goods in that sense. So in this way, you can see that these lacertos tend to be colonial sites of, in certain extent, colonial sites of discipline, taming, and segregation of non-European bodies. So the history of quarantines in past are also histories of enforced social distancing based on race, region, and color. It can be termed as something like a medical apartheid or caste of the disease. Certain diseases were affiliated with certain castes in that sense. So now, when we come to the present scenario, you can again see that the same set of, as a historian of the present, I wish to say something about the present condition also in that sense. When you come to the present, you can again see that the same question of surveillance is coming. So now you are all happy when some biometric device is used in order to understand your temperature. You are all happy because it is to prevent the disease from expanding to other areas, or prevent the disease from getting infected with other bodies in that sense. So that was a question of discipline in that sense. So all the social distancing histories that we witnessed, in one sense, is actually a program, a strategy followed by state systems and control mechanisms in order to discipline the population, number one. Second is that even in disciplining the population, there was a bifurcation of the two worlds, like the white world and the black world in that sense. But now we are not seeing that kind of a differentiation when that is, moreover, in the whole world is so much democratized in that sense. But the question of the present surveillance is also very dangerous in the sense that now you are subjecting to the biometric device surveillance because you do not want to lose your life in that sense, and also you do not want to infect others in that sense. But next case, when the same apparatus is used in order to understand your emotional changes, emotional consciousness, for example, your attitude towards a government, your attitude towards the authorities, if that can be diagnosed through these kind of biometric devices, then that becomes a problem. So the question of surveillance that we are facing now will become a different question of surveillance in the future, when it leads to something like emotional surveillance, that become questionable and problematic. Now, the second issue of social distancing is actually the social distancing. We need to look at the ideology of nationalism. So now, in the social distanced world, how do you look at other nations? I'm not making any comment on the present the warlike situation in our border, but I wish to look at from a historian's point of view and understand how do we look at the ideology of nationalism now? Because the virus knows no nationalism in that sense. It enters from one continent to other continent. For example, in my state, Kerala, once I found that one district where I am living now is separated from the next district, Ernakulam, Cochin, because people from Kottayam, they cannot. That is my district. They cannot move from Kottayam to Ernakulam. So it's a type of new reconfiguration of the maps inside a sovereign state system. So what we need to think are certain sensibilities. The historians need to project and disseminate and transmit these sensibilities like the global solidarity and exchanges. Because if we are one world in that sense, we need to understand at this particular moment, because the only one enemy, the one enemy that is against us is two things are there. One is the virus, and the second is the greed of the humans in that sense. We need to contain that. We need to formulate certain strategies in order to contain through medical and also scientific collaborations wherever it is inevitable. So what is the need of the time at the present moment? Being a truly nationalist and patriot, you have to be an internationalist also. That is what history teaches us. The history teaches us, because you look at this scenario now, suppose the vaccine is invented by the Pakistan, the scientists in Pakistan. Whether people in India are going to say that we are not going to use the vaccine because that is invented in Pakistan. No, we have to use that, because we are all subjected to the particular rationalization of science, of medicine. So we need to go beyond these sensibilities of extremely, what you call, dangerous, hyper-sensical nationalism in that sense, because you have to love others also, the human beings, others in other countries also. So such an internationalization, such a drive for internationalization is to come from historians and history students in that sense. Now, another thing which I just highlighted during the particular period is the issue of people who were, traveling during the pandemic period in India. You have seen a lot of people traveling on their, they were traveling in abject conditions in that sense. Poor people, marginalized people, migration workers in that sense, migrant workers, all of them traveling 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers in that sense. It shows it shows to the historian that even now there is a substrata of the subaltern who lives on the fringes of the development in that sense. They are the highway citizens in that sense, desolate citizens in that sense, who are subjected to the miseries and hardships in these times when we are enjoying the time by reading or engaging in certain culinary experiments, or engaging in games, engaging in digital entertainment, things like that, seeing movies together with our family members. Even then we are unhappy in that sense. Just to think about the people who used to travel across India, covering many districts, many states in order to reach their homelands in that sense. So there is an Indian economy which is on the highway. There is an Indian citizenship which is on the highway. The historical consciousness is to be triggered in that sense to accommodate the new subaltern classes. There is a subaltern classes on highways into histories is also an accountability of the historian in the social confined times. Now, the next thing is, the very area, the domain where we live, like the online education and other changes. Now we are not in a position to go to the classes and teach the students. Now we are open to several, what you call platforms, digital platforms through which you can interact with the people. But you must understand one thing, that this is the only possible remedy now. Just to think the case of the webinar that we are doing now, because it is not possible for me to come to Chidambaram and then to have a discussion with you. But on the contrary, pandemics and pandemic environment, forced us to resort to technology. The webinar, the seminar, the yesterday's seminar, that is, if it was a seminar before March 24, now it is a webinar in that sense. So the car that was going along the straight road, met with an accident and it turned upside down. That is a civilization now. So the civilization is in a position, it's an upside down position. It's in a post position to ruminate about certain strategies to be followed up for a better tomorrow in that sense. Also coming up with the question of the capitalism in that sense. Capitalism and capitalist networks are critiqued by people all over the world. But I am asking one question, is capitalism the only problem that we are facing today? It is because of capitalism that feudalism was defeated. So it's not capitalism, but it's actually, it can be a capitalism which is very different from the early capitalism. Because capitalism was there even in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. Capitalism opened new continents. It established new trade routes. When it established new trade routes, more resources were used by people. Science and technology got disseminated from continent to continent. Profit got accumulated in certain areas. That are all true. But the thing is that it was an emancipatory, when we compare it with feudalism. So what type of a feudalism, capitalism that we are suffering now, we are experiencing now, can be termed in the terminology that is used by Naomi Kilner. It is something like a disaster capitalism. Disaster capitalism. With the present, with the certain promises, on a high-end promises, which have found it to be very ineffective in that sense. But capitalism as a culture is a different ideology, and capitalism as an emancipatory economic ideology is also a very different ideology in that sense. So we need to look, the historians need to look at economics, the economic history is also from a very varied perspective for understanding how the civilization is juxtaposed between capitalism and any new type of system that would ultimately prevail in the post-COVID times. So now, coming to a conclusion, I wish to project 3 points to you. I think my time is over, 1 hour is over. The main points which I wish to place before you is a question of body. Social distancing is a question of, that is something connected with the identity of a body. The body that is chanced or, that is liable to be infected, it is to be segregated. So there are 2 types of bodies. One is the infected body and the non-infected body. And the suspect bodies are also there in that sense, So the body become a metaphor in history in that sense, Why you are following social distancing? It is physical distancing. It is a distancing of the bodies apart in that sense. But that doesn't mean that it is social distancing in that sense. Because social distancing is not there, because all of us are connected through the new advanced forms of technologies in that sense, Because you look at the body factor, the infected body is either to be isolated, the infected body is to be disciplined through social distancing, and the infected body at the same time, the over-infected body, that is actually the body which is diagnosed with the infection, the virus, is to be quarantined. So the body again resurfaces in history. The same body which was there even in the biblical times, the ancient times, which was there even in the medieval times, has come to reinforce as a new site for the historian. The body itself is a new site for the historian to understand. When you look at the body factor, I mean the physical body factor, when that is becoming site of disease, then the same old quarantine mechanism or social distancing mechanism is used by the post-modern society, the post-truth society, when science and technologies are so far in a very advanced, situation. That leads to understand the myth of progress in that sense. What is progress after all? Suppose somebody is asking you, what is progress? What is development? They are giving you a particular teasing question and saying that you have a mobile phone in your hand. At the same time, you think about the fire as a technology that was invented in the upper Paleolithic period, which is widely used in the Neolithic period. So when you compare these two technologies, fire and mobile phone, which is superior technology? There lies the question. The question, which is superior technology? Some people may say that it is the mobile phone which connects the entire world. But had there been no fire, then there would have been no agrarian revolution. Then there would have been no industrial revolution. Then there would have been no mobile phone. So we have to take a certain theoretical juxtaposition argued by Michel Foucault, saying that there are only ruptures in that sense. The fire was invented at a particular time. That is very superior in those times, even now. The mobile phone or nanotechnology or robotics is invented by people in the post-modern period or the post-industrial period. That's also a factor of progress, but there is no relation. You cannot relate to one with the other in the sense. If you relate one with the other, I will be tempted to say that fire is far more superior to the mobile phone in that sense. That's a question of progress. So the body factor also takes the historian to the myth of the progress theory advanced by most of the colonial nations in those times, saying that they came to civilize us in that sense. Of course, there is some truth in that, there is some untruth in that also. So we cannot fully agree with that proposition in that sense. The British said that we are going to introduce plantations in the Nilgiris, so the progress came. Together with that, floods also came. Together with that, marginalization came. Together with the economic drain came. So the myth of the progress continues even today. But that is a very fascinating myth in the sense. When people reach a place when there are a lot of trees and no concrete buildings, there's a natural tendency on the part of the people to say that, oh, there is no progress here in that sense. The trees are something it is depicting, it is not progress. It is savage. It is uncivilized spaces in that sense. So that needs to be corrected. So we need to correct certain notions of progress, certain notions of development in the sense as a myth of progress in that sense. So that is the reason why I am saying that we living in 2020, in the 21st century, how far away are we from the 14th century? For understanding that distance, calculating that distance, social distance is a good rubric. It's a good parameter to understand the distance from the 14th century to the 21st century. Now, the third thing that I wish to advance before you is that only scientific rationality will ultimately win. All superstitions, all what you call biases and prejudices, all gossips, and even gossips regarding where the coronavirus originated and how people used it as a weapon to align or malign some people with coronavirus. That also shows that ultimately scientific rationality will win. The world has proved that it is ultimately with science, it is ultimately with the scientific rationality that we will definitely emancipate and liberate from the clutches of the pandemics in that sense. But how long it will take, it is to be proved by the researches that are going on in the field, in the arena of scientific research. And there comes the fourth important point, that the importance of historical studies and turning the archives. By turning the archives, I mean, you just imagine that you are in the archives before the lockdown period in the pre-COVID times, okay? You are going to the archives, you are seeing a lot of records, and one record about Spanish influenza is coming to your hand. But whereas you are doing something on Indian national movement, or you are doing something on Tamil Nadu local cell phone or whatever be like that. So the pandemic file is coming to you. You just glossed through that and then you leave it because that is not your research problem. Okay. And the turn in the archives is going to come in the post-COVID period, even the COVID times. If you are supposed to go to the archives, I don't know whether the government will permit you to go to the archives now. So now if you go to the archives in the post-COVID period, the experiential historian and the data interacts in a very different role. I will tell you how it works like that. So now suppose again, you are doing something on what you call political history of Tamil Nadu, or some wars or First World War impact or the economic depression, things like that. Now in the post-COVID period, you are coming and confronting with a recorder which is related to the pandemic. Then it is not the historian of the pre-COVID period that is who is going to use and see the post-COVID scenario archives. Archives turned. Archives turned means the historian has turned. The experiential level of the historian has really turned. And now you are sensitively, emotionally attached to the Spanish flu record that is coming into your hands, or the plague record that is coming into your hands, because you are now an experienced historian with the emotional, what you call, quotient of a person who suffered, of a person who witnessed a pandemic that is a coronavirus. So the importance of historical studies and turn in the archives is a very important happening that is going to change the consciousness of historiography or historical writing in the post-COVID times, because social distancing have taught us one thing, that great works will definitely be born in what you call confinement. I think all of you have read Brodel's Mediterranean, Fernand Brodel's Mediterranean. Fernand Brodel's Mediterranean was written in prison because he was jailed from 1939 to 1945. During that time, he wrote the magnum opus Mediterranean in the jail because there was nothing, no other duty for Fernand Brodel. He was completely free. And Brodel himself said, if it was not for the imprisonment, I would have written a different work. It is not Mediterranean, but it can be work on Philip II. So this is a good period of confinement for the historian to ruminate. So social distancing, social confinement, and the moods of quarantine have to prosper, have to promote an intensive desire among the historian to understand the human civilization, the growth of human civilization, and its connection via with pandemics and diseases all through the times. And I used to tell you one more example about Rousseau, French philosopher Rousseau. Some of the most important theories, ideologies came to his mind while he was quarantined. So Rousseau was also quarantined. You know about Antonio Gramsci, who wrote that was also that also happened during he was jailed. Mussolini imprisoned him, and it was for the imprisonment that Antonio Gramsci wrote the prison notebook, Notes on Italian History and Culture, which can be considered as a Bible for understanding cultural hegemony and also theories concerning subaltern and also things. So the importance of the historical studies have resurfaced again. History has to go applied in that sense. History has to go applied in the sense that the emotional trajectories of people living in the medieval century, in the medieval world, it has to be remapped through historiography, through historical writing. Like itself, you can also understand the kind of pandemic stricken India, how it affected Tamil Nadu, how it affected Kerala. Now, one thing that may come to your mind is that now it is a coronavirus and all the documents related to the virus. As of now, it is not a history document. Who told you? Is there any maturity for the history document? People say that you have to consult the records. Taking at least 50 or 60 years for you have to go to 1950 and say that the particular record is a historical document. No, whatever happened yesterday now become a historical document. So this is the best time to redefine and reconfigure historiography and write new histories of the world, especially in the context of the pandemic, because like one major pandemic historian once remarked, when he entered the archives had an order. When he came to examine some of the documents related to the quarantine because of the chemicals sprayed on the letters which were written by quarantined people, which was used to be immersed in certain chemical, what you call oil-like thing. So that particular smell is even there in the archives. So the order of history, ODOUR of history, resurfaces again for us to understand the complexities, interconnected complexities connected with social distancing. Thank you, and I stop here.
Okay. Yes.
We are towards the end of the session. I record my sincere thanks to Dr. Sebastian Joseph for his elaborate presentation on social distancing from past to present. I am also thankful to the participants for their effectual participation. We hope which would have enlightened them on the necessity of social distancing in the present day perilous COVID-19.
See now.
Are there any questions or any? Are there any questions?
No, sir, shall we?
So there are no questions.
No, no, no questions.
Okay, then we are coming to an end.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much for your invite, and thank you all participants.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye, sir. Bye, sir.